Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Monday? Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Gail in Kansas City, Renee in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Yehud in South Carolina, Belle in cold and icy Texas, Nancy in North Carolina, Bella in Florida, Tom in PA, Paul in the Great Northwest, Shandora in the Bronx, Moishi in Brooklyn, Lester in Florida, Elise in Virginia, Lynn in Canada, Marie in Freeport, New York, and Bill in mid-Missouri. Welcome, everybody. May you and all your loved ones be warm and safe in this pretty intense storm that so much of the country is having. May we only hear good news, and let's say Amen. Our daf today's page 16 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. We're picking this up right at the top of page 16a with Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 2. And is this the final Mishnah of the chapter? Yes, this is the final Mishnah of the chapter. We're continuing our discussion of piggul. So that's that idea that if the priest had an intent at the time of slaughtering the offering or collecting its blood, conveying its blood, sprinkling its blood, to mishandle the offering. Right? So one of the rules of the offering is that the edible part has to be eaten within a certain amount of time. For a sin offering, a burnt offering, a guilt offering. The burnt offering, the consumption is by the altar. But let's say the sin offering, the guilt offering, the part that needs to be eaten by the priest has to be eaten that day and the night after. Anything left beyond that needs to be burned, and if someone eats it, they have violated the prohibition of nasar, of eating something after its time. If they have an intention at the time of doing those rituals, at the time of slaughtering it, conveying, bring the blood, etc., if they're already thinking that they're going to eat beyond its time, then that offering is disqualified immediately. And that's what piggul refers to. Now, the word actually means abhorrent. The offering becomes abhorrent to God because the one who's bringing it, when we're doing something that its whole purpose is to bring us near to God and to create a satisfying aroma to God. And a satisfying aroma means that God is pleased because he gave us a commandment and we fulfilled it, not because he loves the smell of barbecue so much. So if you are already planning at the outset to do it wrong, that's even worse than doing it wrong, than making a mistake in the course of the process. So that's piggul. And then the offering is disqualified with that special circumstance of piggul. And then if somebody goes ahead and eats it anyway, eats the edible portion, then he would be subject to charis, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Now, I've already started to talk about in the previous few Mishnayos this idea that, okay, so when are you having this intent? It has to be during the permitting factors, right? So what's going to permit an offering to be accepted? That it was slaughtered, that the blood was for an animal offering, that it was slaughtered, that the blood was collected, that it was conveyed to the altar, and that it was sprinkled. Or in the case of a meal offering, that the handful was properly removed and then put in a service vessel, taken to the altar and burned, along with the frankincense that accompanies the handful of most meal offerings. Now, those are the permitting factors. And now where the real debate is going to be is, well, what if you have piggul intent during some but not all of the permitting factors? Will this offering still be disqualified? For sure. Will it be disqualified as piggul, such that if you then did eat of the remainder of it, you'd be liable to kares? This is going to be a debate between the sages. Excuse me. Okay. Mishnah 6, right at the top of page 16a. With regard to the burning of the handful of a meal offering and the frankincense, both of which render the meal offering permitted for consumption, if the priest had an intention that can render the offering piggul during the burning of the handful, but not during the burning of the frankincense, or during the burning of the frankincense, but not during the burning of the handful, i.e., he burned one of them with the intention to eat the remainder of the offering beyond its designated time, but not the other, right? Not the other. He didn't have a piggul intent during both permitting factors, only one of them. So Rabbi Meir says the offering is piggul, and one who eats it is liable to receive kares because he ate it. And the rabbis, the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, say there is no liability to receive kares in this case unless he renders the offering piggul during the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor, i.e. the burning of both the handful and the frankincense. If he has this wrong intent to eat the remainder beyond its time, sounds like it'll be disqualified, right? Because he's definitely having a faulty intent during some of the permitting factor, but he's not going to render it piggul, and therefore if one ate of it, he shouldn't have eaten of it, but if he did, it won't be a kares-bearing penalty unless he had that piggul intent during all the permitting factor, right? In this case, collecting, burning the handful, collecting, burning the frankincense. And the rabbis concede to Rabbi Meir in the case of a meal offering of a sinner, and in the case of a meal offering of jealousy of a sota, the suspected adulteress, that if one had intent of piggul during the burning of the handful, that the meal offering is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares for its consumption, as here the handful is the sole permitting factor. There is no frankincense. If one slaughtered one of the two lambs that are sacrificed with the two loaves on the holiday on the festival of Shavuot, and while he was slaughtering one of the two lambs, he had intent to partake of the two loaves the next day, which is to say beyond its time. Or if one burned one of the bowls of frankincense with the intent to partake of two arrangements of showbread the next day, Rabbi Meir says the meal offering is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares for its consumption. And the rabbis say there is no liability to receive kares unless he has intent of piggul during the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor. If one slaughtered one of the lambs with the intent to partake of it the next day, the lamb is piggul, and the other is a fit offering. If he slaughtered one lamb with the intent to partake of the other the next day, both lambs are fit offerings, as one permitting factor does not render another permitting factor piggul. This is the strange case of Shavuot, where the animal offerings act as a permitting factor for the meal offerings, the loaves. Okay, that's Mishnah 6. Now we go to the Gemara. Rav says, the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis with regard to a case where one has intent of piggul by either the handful or the frankincense applies only, for instance, when he placed the handful upon the altar in silence, i.e., he did not have a specific intent. He was silent about his intent. And thereafter, he placed the frankincense with intent to partake of the remainder the next day. So in such a case, it is evident that his intent relates only to the frankincense. they're looking a little bit more closely now. Is how would you have split intent? Right? Why would you have one intent about eating the remainder and when you're going to eat it during the handful and a different intent with the frankincense? Since, more or less these things are all done together, why did you change your intent during this process? Well, it might be that he had no intent at the time of burning the handful, and then he said, and I'm going to eat this offering. I'm not so hungry today. I'll eat it tomorrow. Boom. Right? Boom. That's where he could form that piggul intent that would then only be present during the frankincense. That's a situation where Rabbi Meir would say the offering is piggul, and if you eat of it, it's karas. And the rabbis would say, no, he only had the piggul intent during half of the permitting factor, so the offering will be disqualified, but not piggul. But if he placed the handful with the intent to partake of the remainder the next day, and then he placed the frankincense in silence, right? He had no intent when he was doing the second half of the permitting factor, burning the frankincense. He did have the piggul intent during the first half when he was burning the handful. So in that situation, all agree that the meal offering is piggul, right? Because now we're going to say that his silence in the second half means that he was carrying forward his piggul intent from the first half. But if he placed a handful with the intent to partake of the remainder the next day, and then he placed the frankincense in silence, all agree that the meal offering is piggul, as anyone who performs the rites in such a manner performs them in accordance with his initial intent. And Shmuel says, even in such a case, there is still a dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Meir. You can't be so sure that he's carrying forward that faulty piggul intent. It might be that he only had it for the first half and he didn't have it for the second half. But at least according to the other view from Rav, it just shows how important it is to have a correct intent at the outset. This is where New Year's resolutions come from. So you didn't live up to your New Year's resolution. But at least you started the year off with a good intent, and that does have some power to it. Now, the regular New Year's resolutions from our culture, you've probably heard me talk about this before, not much chance of success. Go out, get drunk, drink a bunch of champagne. This is the year I'm going to lose 30 pounds. Next day, wake up with a hangover, have some fried eggs, forget it. But when we talk about the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, where you're going to spend a month examining your deeds in the final month of the year of Elul, and then you're going to be praying, with slichos on a daily basis, and you're going to really form and organize and get those resolutions tightened, exactly what it is that you're planning to do this year and how you're going to achieve it. And then you're going to pray for help every day for this long holiday period. And then you're going to move into the Sukkah 5 days after Yom Kippur, when you're going to have really beaten your chest about all the ways that you let down God and your family and yourself in the previous year. And now you've got a blank slate and you've got this resolution, how you're going to live up to it. And then you acknowledge very humbly that I can't do this without your help, God. This is so fragile, my new resolution. I'm not going to be able to do it without your help. Please help me, God. And that sukkah then represents that new fragile version of yourself, where you've adopted that resolution and made it stick. I mean, even with all that, there's no guarantee that your resolution will take hold, but you have so much better of a chance to take that initial intent and make it work, right? Initial intent and make it work. And so it's an interesting debate here, sort of negative flip side of having an intent at the outset, that if it's a negative intent, right, at least according to one view, that's imputed to you when you just go silent and forgetful. What you adopted at the beginning that was negative, you're carrying that forward. Well, let's hope that also when we adopt positive intentions at the outset and then we go silent and forget, we get some credit for at least wanting to do the right thing. But so much better to get organized and humble about making those things happen. Okay. Where am I? Okay, so Rava sat and stated this law in accordance with the opinion of Rav, right? Of Rav, that your initial intent, if it's silent, and then you form an intent for the second part, okay, so you didn't have it for the whole permitting factor. But if you had that initial intent for the first half and then you were silent in the second half, that would be piggul, because we're going to carry forward the piggul intent from the first half to the silent second half and say you had piggul intent for the whole thing, right? So Rava sat and stated this law in accordance with the opinion of Rav. Rav Acha bar Rav Huna raised an objection to Rava from a Baraisa. In what case is this statement that intent of piggul concerning only the handful renders the meal offering piggul? In what case is this said? It is stated in a case where one had such intent during the removal of the handful, or during the placement of the handful in a service vessel, or during the conveying of the vessel to the altar. Since these rites are not performed with the frankincense, during these stages, the handful is the only relevant permitting factor. So the Brisa continues, but once the priest comes to perform the burning of the handful, then if he placed the handful on the fire of the altar in silence, and he placed the frankincense with intent of piggul, or if he placed the handful with intent and the frankincense in silence, Rabbi Meir says it is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares for its consumption. And the rabbis say, no, there is no liability to receive kares unless he has intent of piggul during the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor. And that would suggest that the sort of earlier steps of removing the handful, putting it in a service vessel, conveying it, are not dispositive, but the sacrifice perhaps is, right, when he actually burns it. Let's see. Let's keep reading. During the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor. So Rav Acha bar Rav Hun explains his objection. In any event, the Baraisa teaches a case where he placed the handful with intent and the frankincense in silence. And yet the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir, and they do not say that one performs the rite of frankincense with his original intent. So Rava answered, say that this is what the Baraisa means. If he placed the handful with intent and he had already placed the frankincense in silence from the outset, then Rabbi Meir and the rabbis disagree. But the Gemara rejects this statement. Whoa, why are you changing the order of operations here? There are two possible refutations of this statement. One is that if Rava's answer is accepted, then this case is identical to the first case of the Baraisa, which already taught that there is a dispute if the initial permitting factor was sacrificed in silence. And furthermore, isn't it taught explicitly in another Baraisa, after placing the handful, he burned the frankincense? So Rabbi Chanina interpreted this Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav. The Baraisa is referring to a case of two intentions, i.e. there were two priests, the first one of whom burned the handful with intent of piggul, and the second burned the frankincense in silence. Since the intent of one priest is entirely independent of the intent of the other priest, it cannot be said that the second priest burns the frankincense in accordance with the intention of the first priest. And the Gemara continues, come and hear a proof for the opinion of Shmuel from a Baraisa that addresses piggul during the sprinkling of the blood of an animal offering. In what case is this statement that the offering is rendered piggul even when he intends only while performing the first placement to eat it beyond its designated time? In what case is this said? It is rendered piggul in the case of blood that is placed on the external altar where one placement renders the offering permitted. Right, so even though for a sin offering, for example, there's supposed to be placement of blood, sprinkling of the blood on four sides of the altar, as we learned in Tractate Zevachim, if he only placed the blood once, right, the first placement, he has effected atonement with that offering. So if the first sprinkling was correct, then all is good. If the first sprinkling was done, wrong, and then that was the only sprinkling there was, well, this offering is disqualified. But that's because one sprinkling is enough. This is going to be the case for all offerings, all animal offerings whose blood was sprinkled on the altar, the main altar, the external altar in the holy temple, in the courtyard of the holy temple. That's going to be distinct and distinguished from sin offerings whose blood was sprinkled inside the sanctuary, like the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, or the bull of an anointed priest, or the bull of the Sanhedrin that ruled erroneously and the people relied on it, or the goat of idolatry that the people relied on, a mistaken ruling of regarding idolatry that the people relied on. A special goat is brought for that. Those are all the inner offerings, the inner sin offerings. For those, there's a very specific number of sprinklings that have to be done inside the sanctuary, and if the priest misses any of them, then the offering is not accepted. It has not created atonement or affected acceptance. However, for whatever reason that offering was being brought, if all the sprinklings aren't done correctly, then that reason is not fulfilled. Right? Whatever their objective was, it is not fulfilled. So that's to tell us that when we're talking about permitting factors, right, so that the offering can sort of be completed according to its law and affect acceptance, when we're talking about inner offerings, then every single one of the sprinklings is an independent and necessary and indispensable permitting factor for everything to be done, as opposed to a sin offering, a regular sin offering of an individual, where there are 4 sprinklings, but you only need the first one in order to effect acceptance. Now, says the Gemara, but with regard to the blood that is placed inside, in the Holy of Holies, on the curtain, and on the inner altar, for example, the 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and goat of Yom Kippur, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for an unwitting sin of the anointed priest, and the 11 presentations of the blood of the bull for unwitting communal sin, if the priest had an intention that can render the offering piggul, whether in the first set of presentations, whether in the second set, or whether in the third set, i.e. in any of the requisite sets of presentations, for example, in the case of the Yom Kippur bull in the Holy of Holies, the sprinklings that are done on the curtain and on the inner altar. So about this, Rabbi Meir says, if he had that piggul intent during any one of those sprinklings, then the offering is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares if he eats of it. And the rabbis, right, the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, say there is no liability to receive kares, meaning piggul was not created, unless he had an intention that could render an offering piggul during the performance of the entire permitting factor, right? So the rabbis versus Rabbi Meir, it's the same argument from this Mishnah over and over. The rabbis say, unless he had a piggul intent during all of the permitting factor, there's no piggul. And Rabbi Meir says if he had a piggul intent during any of the permitting factor, it is piggul. The Gemara explains its proof to the current question. In any event, this Baraisa teaches if the priest had an intention that can render the offering piggul, whether in the first set of presentations, whether in the second set, or whether in the third set, and Rabbi Meir and the rabbis disagree in this case as well. So evidently, the rabbis are not of the opinion that anyone who performs a rite performs it in accordance with his initial intent. Right? So they're saying, obviously the rabbis are not going to go with this idea of the initial intent is dispositive, because if they're saying you could have a partial intent during any of these steps, well, it must be possible that either you could have an initial intent and then lose it, or you could, have a no intent, or, a legitimate intent at the beginning, and then, have a faulty intent later. Either way, the rabbis are not holding that, if you had the wrong intent at the beginning and then were silent later, that the whole thing is piggul, because they're saying you could have, you could have split intent, right, during all those presentations of the blood inside the sanctuary. And if you would say that here too the Baraisa is referring to a case of two intentions. For example, one high priest performed the initial presentation and was thereafter disqualified from performing the other presentation. Something happened to him. He got sick. He became tameh somehow, and we had to bring in the deputy high priest to finish the offerings of Yom Kippur in the middle of Yom Kippur. Right, and a second priest replaced him and performed the remaining presentations. There would still be a difficulty because this works out well according to the one who says at the verse, with this shall Aaron come into the sacred place with a young bull, right? Talking about Yom Kippur, he has to bring the blood of a bull and of the goat of Yom Kippur. With this shall Aaron come into the sacred place with a young bull. This indicates that a high priest may enter the sanctuary even with the blood of a bull, i.e. he may continue the presentations with the blood of the offering slaughtered by another high priest. But according to the one who says that the verse indicates that a high priest may enter with a young bull, but not with the blood of a bull, i.e. a replacement high priest must slaughter another bull and begin the presentations all over again, well, then what can be said? If so, it is impossible for these presentations to be split between two priests, according to the view that if the high priest is disqualified in Yom Kippur, the second high priest who steps into his place is going to have to start all the procedures of Yom Kippur from the top. So Rav has said, according to Rav, here in the Baraisa, we are dealing with a case where the high priest had an intent of piggul during the first set of presentations, and then he was silent during the second set. Are we going to impute to him that his initial intention carries through to the later presentations where he had no specific intent? Right, so we are dealing with a case where the high priest had intent of piggul during the first set, and then he was silent during the second set, and then he again had an intent of piggul during the third set. So in such a case, we say, if it enters your mind to say that anyone who performs a rite performs it in accordance with his initial intention, then why do I need the high priest to repeat his intent of piggul during the third set? The fact that he repeats his intention during the third set indicates that he did not perform the second set in accordance with the initial intent. So accordingly, the rabbis hold that the offering is not piggul, as he did not have an intent of piggul during the presentation of the entire permitting factor. Rav Ashi does not like this explanation. He objects. He says, does the Baraisa teach that the high priest was silent? Rather, Rav Ashi said, here we're dealing with a case where he had an explicit intent of piggul during the first, second, and third presentations, and he was silent during the subsequent presentations. So in such a case, we say, if it enters your mind to say that anyone who performs a rite performs it in accordance with his initial intention, why do I need the high priest to repeat his intent of piggul during the second and third presentations? It must be that he has to actually have an intent at the beginning of each presentation, and if he doesn't, we're not going to impute what came before. Now we're at the top of 16b, but the Gemara raised a difficulty against Rav Ashi's interpretation. But the Baraisa teaches whether during the first presentation or whether the second, and this indicates that the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir, even with regard to a case where the priest had intent of piggul during any of the presentations. And the Gemara notes, indeed, this poses a difficulty. Now, the Gemara returns to the discussion of this Baraisa that we have brought in to help us understand our Mishnah. The master said above, if the priest had intent of piggul, whether in the first set of presentations, whether in the second set, or whether in the third set, Rabbi Meir says offering is piggul. And if one eats of it, he's liable to receive karas, despite the fact that he performed the rest of the rite silently. Right? Now, it's not because we're imputing his initial intent to the rest of it. It's that according to Rabbi Meir, if you have the piggul intent during any of the permitting factors, the offering is piggul, end of story. Where am I? Now the Gemara asks, now consider, one is not liable to receive kares unless all the permitting factors of the offering have been sacrificed, i.e. if the whole service is completed, including the presentation of the blood. Now we're not talking about having the wrong intent. Now we're saying for piggul to take hold, we learned this in Tractate Zevachim, so the priest has to have this faulty intent at the outset, either during the slaughter or one of the other permitting factors. Some would say during all the permitting factors. But having had that intent, then the permitting factors actually have to be executed, right? So he had the wrong intent. They should have just stopped this thing, at which point there's not even going to be piggul, then it just has to be disposed of. But if he had the wrong intent, and then he did everything, right? The blood was collected, it was collected, conveyed, and sprinkled. Okay, so then it was done according to its mitzvah, but because he had that initial piggul intent, now the offering is piggul, right? So for it to actually become piggul, you have to have this intent at the outset. The disagreement between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis is, do you have to have that intent throughout all the permitting factors or just some? Okay, that's their dispute, but they would all agree that for the offering to actually become piggul, that all those permitting factors have to be carried out and carried out properly. If the offering, for example, left the courtyard during this process, now you've compounded the error and piggul will not take hold of this offering. Okay, so unless all the permitting factors of the offering have been sacrificed, i.e. if the whole service is completed, including the presentation of the blood, all that has to be done so that piggul can actually take hold of the offering. Now, the Gemara provides the source for this claim, as the Master said, that the verse states, with regard to piggul in Leviticus 7:18, which is the source for piggul, it shall not be accepted, which indicates that the acceptance of a disqualified offering is like the acceptance of a valid offering, of which the verse states, it shall be accepted in Leviticus 22:27. And just as there is no acceptance of a valid offering unless all its permitting factors have actually been sacrificed, so too there is no lack of acceptance of a disqualified offering, i.e. it is not rendered piggul, unless all its permitting factors have been sacrificed. That is to say, in the absence of one of its permitting factors actually being carried out, forget about intention for a second, if the permitting factors aren't all done, the action of them is not done, piggul will not take hold. Accordingly, the Gemara challenges, and with regard to this case of the blood of the bull and the goat brought on Yom Kippur, since he had intent of piggul with regard to it when he was presenting the blood inside the Holy of Holies, he has disqualified it. If so, when he sprinkles the blood again later in the sanctuary on the curtain and the inner altar, it is as though he is merely sprinkling water and not the blood of the offering. Consequently, the permitting factors of the offering have not been sacrificed, and therefore the offering should not be rendered piggul. This might be a difference with respect to inner offerings that can only apply to inner offerings, and maybe it can't apply to regular sin offerings whose blood is sprinkled on the outer altar, right, where the first sprinkling affects acceptance. So, you don't even have to necessarily do the other sprinklings. But inside the sanctuary, and even more in the Holy of Holies, every single sprinkling has to be done correctly. So what they're saying here is, okay, and if you had a piggul intent, you've disqualified the offering, and then these other sprinklings, even if the action was done correctly, they shouldn't count, because that earlier faulty intention disqualified the offering, and these later sprinklings are meaningless. Rabbah said, you find it possible, right? So in other words, so how could you even have piggul intent that goes over the course of multiple sprinklings, since once you have that earlier piggul intent, you've disqualified the offering, and all these later sprinklings are meaningless. So Rabbah says, no, actually we can concoct a scenario where the other sprinklings are valid, and yet, you could have piggul intent. How? So Rabbah said, you find it possible in a case where there were 4 bulls and 4 goats. There's only 1 bull and 1 goat. Well, there's 2 goats, but one is a scapegoat. There's only 1 goat, that is slaughtered and its blood brought into the sanctuary on Yom Kippur. So what's this 4 bulls and 4 goats? What are we talking about here? i.e., in a case where, after the high priest presented the blood inside the Holy of Holies with piggul intent, the remaining blood spilled. Consequently, he was required to bring another bull and goat in order to present their blood on the curtain, separating the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. During that presentation, he had an intent of piggul, after which the remaining blood spilled, requiring him to bring another bull and goat in order to present their blood on the corners of the golden altar. He again had piggul intent during that presentation, and then the blood spilled, which meant that he had to bring yet another bull and another goat in order to present their blood on the golden altar itself. So that is a situation where he had piggul intent during every sprinkling, but each sprinkling came at a stage in the process where it was coming from a fresh animal. It was not disqualified until he had that new piggul intent. This forgetful priest kept having the wrong intent. Rava said, you may even say that the Baraisa is referring to a case of only one bull and one goat, and the remaining blood was in fact disqualified. Nevertheless, with regard to rendering and offering piggul, the presentations performed with the disqualified blood do effect acceptance, as though the entire permitting factor was performed in its proper manner. In other words, even though the high priest sprinkled the blood inside the Holy of Holies with improper intent and thereby disqualified the offering, nevertheless, since he completed the service, he is considered as having sacrificed all the permitting factors with regard to piggul, and so piggul will take hold. Now, the Baraisa mentioned that there are 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and the goat sacrificed on Yom Kippur. This was incidental to our proof of the question right between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Is the piggul intent, does the priest have to have it throughout the permitting factors or only some of them, as Rabbi Meir would argue? And so then we looked at an inner offering like the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur. And the Baraisa that we were looking at mentioned that there are 43 blood presentations. Well, now that that's been mentioned, the sages are like, whoa. Not everybody agrees that there are 43 sprinklings between the bull and the goat on Yom Kippur, since there is a different view about the number of blood sprinklings on Yom Kippur. We're going to examine that other view right now. The Baraisa mentioned that there are 43 presentations of the blood of the bull and the goat sacrificed on Yom Kippur. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught otherwise in a different Baraisa, which states that there are 47 presentations of that blood? And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult. La kasha. This statement that there are 43 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the high priest mixes the blood of the bull and the goat before placing it on the corners of the inner altar, right? The golden incense altar inside the sanctuary, which only gets sprinkled on Yom Kippur or these other special inner offerings that we've talked about. Otherwise, all sprinklings are on the altar, the big altar in the courtyard. Okay, let's go back to this. Of the inner altar, rather than placing the blood of each one separately. And that statement that there are 47 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the high priest does not mix the two types of blood before placing them on the corners, but rather sprinkles 4 times from the blood of the bull and then another 4 times from the blood of the goat, and only afterward mixes the blood of the 2 animals for placement on the top of the altar. Now the Gemara raises another difficulty, but isn't it taught in yet another Baraisa that there are 48 presentations? And the Gemara answers, this also, not difficult, la kasha. This statement that there are 48 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the pouring of the remainder of the blood on the base of the external altar in the courtyard is indispensable to the procedures of Yom Kippur. Right, we've seen this in Tractate Zevachim. Every single one of those sprinklings inside the sanctuary and inside the Holy of Holies is indispensable, is essential to effect atonement, whether for the Yom Kippur offerings or these other special inner offerings. But once you've done all those sprinklings, you've got a vessel containing the blood of those offerings. What do you do with it? The remainder. You take it outside of the sanctuary and you pour it on the western base of the external altar. Is that pouring out of the remainder of the blood itself indispensable to effecting atonement with those offerings? And there was a split view on that. Some said yes, it is indispensable. Others said no. Once you did all the sprinklings correctly, you have effected atonement. The correct procedure is to pour out the remainder of the blood on the altar. But if you didn't, if it somehow spilled before you got there, the goal of those offerings was already achieved. Right? So this statement that there are 48 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the pouring of the remainder of the blood on the base of the external altar is indispensable. And therefore this act is added to the total. And that statement that there are only 47 presentations is in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that the pouring of the remainder of the blood of inner offerings is not indispensable. Next topic. Back to our Mishnah. Mishnah number 6, the final Mishnah here in chapter 2. The Mishnah taught, if one had intent of piggul during the sacrifice of only part of the permitting factors, for example, during the burning of the handful, but not during the burning of the frankincense, then the rabbis rule that the offering is not piggul, right? And that in contradistinction to Rabbi Meir's ruling. Concerning this, a dilemma was raised before the sages. If one had intent of piggul during the conveying of the handful to the altar, but not during the conveying of the frankincense, then what is the law? Right? So we have two permitting factors, basically burning the handful on the altar and burning the frankincense on the altar, both of which require conveying, but conveying is itself not a whole permitting factor, right? It's just ancillary to burning it on the altar. You're going to have to convey it to the altar in order to burn it, but it is totally subservient to the burning of it. So what about if you had this piggul intent just during the conveying to the altar? Then what? So Rabbi Yochanan says the law with regard to conveying the handful to the altar is like the law of removing the handful. Just as intent of piggul with regard to removing only the handful renders the offering piggul, as it is the sole permitting factor with which the rite of removal is performed, the same applies to conveying the handful. That's Rabbi Yochanan. And Reish Lakish says the conveying of the handful is like its burning. Just as intent of piggul is required during the burning of both the handful and the frankincense for the offering to be rendered piggul, as both of them are burned on the altar, the same law applies to conveying. And so the Gemara asks, well, granted, one can understand the ruling of Reish Lakish, as the conveying of the handful is only part of the permitting factors, since there is also the conveying of the frankincense. But as for the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan, what is the reason that intent of piggul during conveying of only the handful renders the offering piggul? Sounds like he's agreeing with Rabbi Meir. After all, he has not had intent of piggul during the conveying of all. He didn't have a piggul intent when he was conveying the frankincense, only when he was conveying the handful. Rava said, Rabbi Yochanan holds that if one performed any sacrificial rite that does not permit the offering, for example, conveying, right? Conveying doesn't permit the offering, not until you burn what you conveyed. Right? So if one performed any sacrificial rite that does not permit the offering, for example, conveying, so even if he performed it with only one of the permitting factors, such as with the handful, but not with the frankincense, it is considered a significant rite with regard to rendering the offering piggul on account of it by itself. It is not comparable to a case of intent of piggul during the sacrifice of only part of the permitting factors, as this rite of conveying does not render the offering permitted. It doesn't render the offering permitted, so you would think that having piggul intent during only the conveying would therefore not render it piggul, but Rabbi Yochanan's going the other way. No, it's not significant enough to render the offering permitted, but it is significant enough to attach piggul. It's a little bit surprising. Abaye said to Rava, but what about the slaughter of one of the lambs that is brought with the 2 loaves on Shavuot, which is a rite that does not permit the offering, as neither the sacrifice of its portions designated for burning upon the altar nor the consumption of the meat of the offering and the 2 loaves is permitted by this slaughter, because you have to slaughter 2 lambs. And yet, the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir in this case also. As we learned in the Mishnah, if one slaughtered one of the 2 lambs with the intent to partake of 2 loaves the next day, or if one burned one of the bowls of frankincense with the intent to partake of 2 arrangements of the showbread the next day, Rabbi Meir says the meal offering is piggul, and one is liable to receive kares if he eats from it. And the rabbis say there's no liability to receive kares unless he has intent of piggul during the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor. Although the slaughter of one of the lambs is a rite that does not render the offering permitted, nevertheless, the rabbis maintain that it is not considered a significant rite with regard to rendering the offering piggul by itself. And Rava said to Abaye, do you maintain that the 2 loaves of bread are already sanctified from when they are in the oven and require only the sprinkling of the blood to render them permitted for consumption? In fact, the slaughter of the lambs sanctifies the loaves, and an act that comes to sanctify is considered like that which comes to permit. Here's the difference. One kind of action permits, another kind of action sanctifies. And that which sanctifies might have a higher level of significance in the sense that a partial intent with respect to just one of these actions that sanctifies might be enough to render piggul. An act that comes to sanctify is considered like that which comes to permit. And since the slaughter of the 2 lambs sanctifies the loaves, the slaughter of each lamb is considered half a permitting factor, and the slaughter of each lamb independently cannot render the loaves piggul. So Rav Shimi bar Ashi raises an objection from a baraisa that discusses the slaughter of the Pesach, the Passover offering. The first Tana rules that if one slaughtering the Paschal lamb, right, the Pesach, intended for it to be consumed by both disqualified individuals, for example, uncircumcised males, and fit individuals, for example, circumcised males, then the offering is not disqualified. And Acherim say, right, that's a code that we know as Rabbi Meir, in a case where one slaughtered a Pesach and severed one of the 2 organs of ritual slaughter with a disqualifying intention, and he severed the other organ with a valid intention, right? As he's slaughtering the animal, he has to cut the trachea and the esophagus, and if he has a proper intention while he's cutting one of those, but an improper intention during the second, then what? Acherim say in a case where one slaughtered Pesach and severed one of the 2 organs of ritual slaughter with a disqualifying intention, and he severed the other organ with a valid intention. Then, if one's intent with regard to circumcised males preceded the intent with regard to uncircumcised males, the offering is valid. But if the intent with regard to the uncircumcised males preceded the intent with regard to the circumcised males, that Pesach would be disqualified. So Rav Shimi bar Ashi continues, and we maintain that the first Tana and Acherim disagree with regard to whether the sacrifice of half a permitting factor with disqualifying intent disqualifies the entire offering. In this case, although this slaughter does not sanctify anything, the severing of one of the organs is considered half of a permitting factor. And Rav has said to Rav Shimi bar Ashi, do you maintain that the blood is already sanctified while inside the neck of the animal? In fact, the knife sanctifies the blood. And that which comes to sanctify is considered like that which comes to permit. Consequently, the slaughter of the animal is a permitting factor, and the severing of one of its organs is half a permitting factor. Not easy material, right? And it's like, we really have to just keep reminding ourselves, yes, this was done historically. There were offerings made when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. And they probably had a somewhat simpler set of rules that they had, arrived at over the many centuries when offerings were being brought. But that's not going to stop our sages who lived later, after the Second Temple was destroyed, from drilling down to the real nitty-gritty And it's not so much about the blood and the offerings and the permitting and the sanctification. It's about the law, right? It's about the law. Because when they identify a situation that doesn't fit neatly into one of the obvious categories of the law, well, then how are we going to answer the question? It could theoretically happen. So how would we answer that question? And that's when we have to drill down really hard and try to keep all this logic straight so that we can arrive at an answer. And the beauty of this is that God gave a law book, the Torah, right, which also tells us our origin tale and national stories, moral stories, uplifting stories, ethical stories, even funny stories about ourselves and our ancestors. But that also functions as a law book. And that law book was necessarily ambiguous on certain questions that would come up. And the only way to answer those questions would be to have sages in every generation that could drill down with an incredibly sharp tool of logic and memory and understanding and precedent and arrive at the answer through extended, and extensive and deep Torah study. That's the tradition we're joining in with now. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. In what case is this statement that intent of piggul with regard to only the handful renders the meal offering piggul? In what case is this said? It is said in a case where one had such intent during the removal of the handful, or during the placement of the handful in a service vessel, or during the conveying. Right now we're dividing up the steps of burning the handful into all the little steps that are necessary so you can burn a handful. And what if you have piggul intent during some of those but not the others? So now the Gemara clarifies where it's headed. And what? Is it not correct to say that the Baraisa that we're using to try to answer our question about the Mishnah is referring to the conveying of the handful taken from the meal offering and placed in a service vessel and then conveyed to the altar. And it was the conveying of the handful for burning upon the altar, in which case it is teaching that intent of piggul with regard to the handful during its conveying does render the offering piggul. And the Gemara responds, no. The Baraisa is referring to the conveying of the handful before its placement into the service vessel. That sanctifies it. Since the frankincense is not placed into a vessel, in this case, the conveying of the handful alone is considered the performance of the entire rite. So the Gemara asks, well, if so, why does the Baraisa state during the placement of the handful in a vessel or during the conveying? This indicates that it is referring to an act of conveying that occurs after the placement. If it was the way you're describing, and earlier in the Gemara, it should have stated during the conveying or during the placement of the handful in a vessel. And the Gemara responds, no, this is not difficult. La kasha. As one should amend the Baraisa and teach it in that order, i.e., with the conveying before the placement. But the Gemara raises another objection from the next clause of the same Baraisa. Once he comes to perform the burning of the handful, there is no liability to receive kares unless he has intent of piggul during the sacrifice of the frankincense as well. Now we're back to the basic case. If he doesn't have piggul intent during both burning the handful and burning the frankincense, no piggul. But how can we arrive at these other cases where seemingly, just having piggul intent during a sub-step of burning the handful, namely just conveying the handful, could create piggul for the whole offering? How would that work? Once he comes to perform the burning of the handful, there is no liability to receive kares unless he has the intent of piggul during the sacrifice of the frankincense as well. Well, what is during the sacrifice? Maybe it's enough to have piggul intent during a sub-step of the handful and a sub-step of the frankincense. Then you have piggul intent both during the handful and during the frankincense, even though you didn't have piggul intent throughout all the steps of the handful and throughout all the steps of the frankincense. Maybe that's where we're going. Let's see. The Gemara asks, according to Reish Lakish, the Baraisa should have stated, once he comes to perform the conveying and to perform the burning. So Reish Lakish maintains that the conveying mentioned previously in the Baraisa occurs earlier, before its placement into a service vessel, which means that there is another act of conveying. And the Gemara responds, this is not difficult. Since the conveying is for the purpose of the burning, it is called burning in the Baraisa. So it might be that, okay, in order for, according to the majority, to have piggul, you have to have a piggul intent during both the handful and the frankincense. But it might not mean that means you have to have it piggul intent from taking the handful out of the meal offering, placing it in a service vessel, conveying it to the altar, and burning it on the altar. And, whatever steps is needed to set up the frankincense to convey it and then burn it, you might not have to have piggul intent for all of those steps, but just enough that you have during some of the steps involved in the handful and some of the steps involved in the frankincense. And the Gemara further challenges, but the Bryce also states, if he placed a handful on the altar in silence, and he placed the frankincense with intent of piggul. So therefore, according to Reish Lakish, it should have also stated, if he carried the handful in silence and the frankincense with the intent of piggul. As according to Reish Lakish, it is the act of conveying that he is performing at this stage. And the Gemara responds, right, that is a difficulty if we're going into this analysis based on the sub-steps. Now, the Gemara continues its discussion of piggul intent that occurred during the sacrifice of part of the permitting factor. If one burned an amount the size of a sesame seed, now that's definitely smaller than the minimum volume of an olive bulb, but if one burned an amount the size of a sesame seed of the handful and frankincense with the intent to consume an amount the size of a sesame seed from the remainder of the meal offering, the edible part, but to do it the next day. Okay, so this is a very weird question. So while he's burning a sesame seed size part of the handful, he has in mind that he's going to eat a sesame seed size part of the remainder of the meal offering beyond its time the next day. Since his piggul intent is with regard to such a small amount, like how could this possibly create piggul? It's much less than the olive bulk minimum measure that normally is required for a piggul intent. So what's going on here? Okay, so if while he's burning a tiny bit, he has in mind to eat a tiny bit beyond its time, and he repeated the same action with that accompanying improper intent over and over and over. So you're dividing this thing into units, but at the end, he's going to burn the whole handful, and let's say, and all the frankincense, and during each one of those mini steps, he had in mind to eat a sesame seed size amount of the remainder, but by the time he finished all the burning, he had in mind, to eat far more than the minimum amount. He just did it step by step. Are we going to combine all those sesame seed size portions to say, yeah, this guy had piggul intent? Right? If one burned an amount the size of a sesame seed of the handful and frankincense with intent to consume an amount the size of a sesame seed from the remainder the next day, and he repeated the same action with the accompanying intent until he burned the entire measure of the handful and the frankincense, the law in this case, believe it or not, is a matter of dispute. The dispute is between Rav Chizda, Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Sheshas. One of them says that the entire meal offering is piggul, and one says that the offering is disqualified but is not piggul, and one of them says the offering remains fit. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that the one who says that the meal offering is piggul holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that one renders an offering piggul on account of piggul intent during the sacrifice of even part of its permitting factors. And the one who says that the offering is disqualified but not piggul holds in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who say that such intent disqualifies an offering but does not render it piggul. And finally, the one who says that the offering is fit, was not rendered even disqualified, he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, who said on page 14a that if one slaughters each of the 2 lambs brought on Shavuot with the 2 loaves, each time intending to consume half an olive bolt from a different loaf the next day, the offering is fit, as these halves do not combine to render the offering piggul. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Now, the Gemara rejects this suggestion. From where is this conclusion drawn? Perhaps Rabbi Meir states that one renders an offering piggul on account of piggul intent during the sacrifice of part of the permitting factors only there, where he had intent with regard to its entire measure. But here, where he did not have intent with regard to its entire measure, but instead had a series of intentions with regard to a measure equivalent to a sesame seed, which is to say much smaller than the minimum measure, then it is possible that Rabbi Meir does not render this offering piggul. And furthermore, perhaps the rabbis state that one does not render an offering piggul unless he has piggul intent during the sacrifice of the entire permitting factor, only there where he did not have intent concerning it during the entire permitting factor, but only during the burning of the handful. But here, where he had intent during the entire permitting factor, i.e. during the burning of both the handful and the frankincense, he has indeed rendered the offering piggul, despite the fact that each intention referred to only a small portion of the entire measure, since he repeated it over and over. And perhaps Rebbe states that the offering is valid only if he had intent of piggul with regard to half an olive bolt from each loaf, only there where he did not subsequently complete his intention with regard to the full measure from the same sacrificial rite, as he had piggul intent with regard to half an olive bolt during the slaughter of each lamb independently. But here, where he subsequently completed the intention with regard to a full measure from the same rite, perhaps he has disqualified the offering. You can't extend, by analogy, these rulings from another situation where here we've got a bunch of differences, this sesame seed at a time, but over and over and over again, maybe we can't extend that logic to this situation. So rather, the one who says that an offering is piggul, when one repeatedly burns an amount the size of a sesame seed from the handful and frankincense with intent to consume an amount the size of a sesame seed from the remainder the next day, would claim that all of the Tanaim agree that it is piggul. And similarly, the one who says that it is disqualified but not piggul would contend that all agree that it is disqualified. And the one who says that it is fit, he would also maintain that everybody agrees with him. Right? This is the danger of extending the law from one situation to another where we have multiple factual differences. And the Gemara explains, the one who says that all agree it is piggul maintains that the manner of its consumption is such a manner, i.e. in small portions, and likewise the manner of its burning is also in such a manner. And the one who says that all agree that it is disqualified but not piggul holds that the manner of its consumption is not such a manner. People don't eat that way. Accordingly, this type of piggul intent does not render the offering piggul. And the manner of its burning is also not in such a manner, and consequently it is like a meal offering whose handful was not burned properly, and it would therefore be disqualified, although not rendered piggul. And finally, the one who says that all agree that this never even became unfit holds that the manner of its burning is in such a manner, and therefore the burning was performed properly, but the manner of its consumption is not in such a manner, which means that the piggul intent with regard to one sesame seed at a time is inconsequential, and therefore the offering was never rendered unfit. That is where we will stop. Take a few questions. Tom says, I'm confused. How can you have an intention of piggul? Okay, well, the word piggul means abhorrent, but it's used as a legal term to mean that you had intent to eat beyond its time at the time that you were doing the permitting factors. And so that's why it's worded in our discussion as intent of piggul, but maybe it'd be more accurate to say intent to eat beyond its time, which necessarily renders the offering piggul. Sharon, is the priest obligated to reveal his intentions? What happens if the priest has improper intent but does not reveal this? How does that impact on the outcome of the sacrifice? This is a great question, right? I mean, these legal rulings can only possibly apply where the priest has the wrong intent and reveals he has the wrong intent, and then we have to, clean up in aisle 6. Like, what are we going to do? because he had the wrong intent, how bad was the intent, how far-reaching was the intent, and how many different steps did he have that intent. And once we understand what the intent was, then we can issue a ruling of how to handle that situation. But if the priest had such an intent and never revealed that to anyone, well, then it's between him and God, right? Now, what's interesting about that is, but there's another person involved, the owner of the offering. So if this priest had the wrong intent, he never said that to anybody, then that person who brought the offering, did he actually effect acceptance with it? Like, did he fulfill his obligation to bring a sin offering or to fulfill his vow if it was a vow offering? It would seem not. But how can we even possibly know that or deal with it? After the fact, they say, well, this guy had the wrong intent. And if he had the wrong intent, then this is what follows. But if he never revealed that, now, if he simply had no intent, right, then what we've said is if he had no intent whatsoever, if he just, in a simple manner like a child performed the actions that are required of him, then we assume he had correct intent. It's only when he had improper intent that things are disqualified. But for that disqualification to actually take hold in the real world, he'd have to reveal that he had that intent, seems to me. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Tuesday, regular Tuesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good day.